Charles Roworth's The Art of Defence on Foot is one of the most widely studied and practiced sabre manuals today, and yet it's often said that we don't know much about the author or the book. Would you like to know more? Follow along. Hi, I'm Nick Thomas of the Academy of Historical Fencing, and I've been studying and practicing from Roworth's manual for almost 20 years now. Put a lot of time into both the teaching and the research and everything surrounding the culture around it. And here's my original copy of The Art of Defence on Foot from 1798. This is the second edition, which was published in the same year as the first in 1798 with only minor updates. And, people say there's not much to be said about Roworth. In fact, there's actually quite a lot to be said, and more turns up over time. And so I'm going to delve into the man himself and the manual, the origins, all the influences, so stick around. But to talk about Charles Roworth, we actually have to talk about quite a few other personalities of the era, because they actually have quite a part to play in his story. And that's quite a varied set of individuals, from the celebrated cavalryman Gaspar Le Marchant, the famous Angelo fencing dynasty, the swordmaster James Taylor, visionary volunteer Colonel Herries, soldier and controversial Scottish journalist and broadsword expert James Perry, soldier and author Major Charles James, and even celebrated fiction author Jane Austen. We even have to discuss a legal case over this book, which still remains an important part of copyright law in today's Britain. The short version is that Charles Roworth was a book printer, but also a volunteer soldier and a passionate amateur of fencing who compiled a fantastic work on military swordsmanship. He compiled the teachings of past and present swordmasters to create the first ever true manual on infantry sword combat in Britain, or we might call this British military sabre today. Now I say sabre because that's the term that is most commonly used today, but of course if we look at the title page of the book, it is for broadsword, it is for sabre, it is for spadroon. The broadsword, the sabre, and the spadroon, but also for the short swords of the era such as the hanger and the cutlass. For most people, that's probably all you want to know, and you'd like to just get stuck into the manual, do some reading, do some practice with it. And if you'd like to do that, you can head to our website, the Academy of Historical Fencing. The web address is swordfight.uk. I'll put the link in the description, and you can get 2 editions of the Roworth manual, the 2nd and the 4th editions, completely for free as PDFs. So please check them out and get training. However, if you'd like to take a much deeper dive into the man and the manual, stick with me and I'm going to take you through it all. Now, to really understand Roworth, we have to look to the years leading up to the publication of his manual and the changes in the swords being used and the practice of swordsmanship and the systemization of it. For it was a time of rapid development and change. And these changes and the personalities involved in it will give us a massive insight into who and what influenced Roworth to create this iconic work of military swordsmanship. The 18th century saw tremendous changes in society, in large part due to the Industrial Revolution and the rise of industrial nations. With this industry came an increase in standardization of military equipment, perhaps best characterized by the British musket of this era, the Lance Pattern musket, or commonly referred to as the Brown Bess. Despite the use of gunpowder weapons becoming increasingly dominant on the battlefield, cold steel would remain incredibly important throughout the 18th century and into the next century also. The late 18th century saw the rise of standardization patterned swords in the same way that it had for the musket earlier in the century. Whilst Britain fought on and off wars with the Kingdom of France and later the Republic of France following the French Revolution, this era in Britain was defined by a terrifying prospect of a French invasion, which led to rapid advancements in recruitment, training and weaponry. And this brings us to our first character, Gaspar Le Marchant. Gaspar Le Marchant was a British cavalry officer who saw action during the Low Countries or the Flanders campaign in the early 1790s, 1792 to 1795, and he was absolutely appalled by the quality of British swords and the methods of swordsmanship. Now, the sword in use at the time for the light cavalry was this, the 1788 light cavalry pattern. There were also some essentially larger, straighter broadsword types for the heavy cavalry as well. But he was just appalled by, the quality and effectiveness in terms of, not landing blows, breaking swords, bad technique. And at the same time, he was massively impressed by many of the allies, such as the Austrians and Hungarians. Back in England, Gaspar Le Marchant enlisted the help of famous sword cutler Henry Osborne. Together, they created a new and better sword design based on Le Marchant's experiences in battle. Enter the 1796 light cavalry trooper sabre, probably the most famous of British sword designs. Now, honestly, it is not drastically different to what replaced it, but what differences there are do make somewhat notable an improvement, and that is it's a bit shorter, a bit more nimble, it also hits a bit harder with a bit more mass at the tip, it's more durable with a stronger shoulder, has a different grip shape and a different guard shape which allows certain other actions and grip types, and so it was an improvement. But significantly for us, Le Marchant didn't just develop a new sword, he created a new mythology for using it. And Le Marchant had the ear of the king, that's King George. And as a result, he was very influential, and he created a manual, a sword exercise manual for the cavalry at the same time as designing the new sword, and it got accepted as the standard, becoming the first ever accepted British Army manual on swordsmanship. Now, this sabre wasn't just for the light cavalry, it was also used by lots of yeomanry units and volunteer units, the horse artillery. It also influenced certain infantry sabres of the time as well, so it was actually quite widespread in its application or things based upon it. Now, Le Marchant was a reformer, and his ideas on swords and swordsmanship were far-reaching. But you might now ask, what is his connection to Charles Roworth? Well, the key here is in that mention of Austrian methods, and throughout British Napoleonic sources you're going to see mention to Austrian and Hungarian methods alongside Highland or Scotch. Now, Scotch refers to Scottish Highlanders, and this is the broadsword practice more widely used across the whole of the British Isles. The term Scotch or Highlander was often applied. It might have been that they were using Scottish techniques, but also as a marketing strategy as well, but it's the method being used across the whole of the British Isles, as depicted in a lot of 18th century fencing manuals such as MacBain and Lonergan, among many others. Now, the mention of Austrian methods, that is the link from Roworth to Le Marchant, because Le Marchant brought in these, what he perceived to be Austrian or Hungarian methods into British swordsmanship. But what were those Austrian methods? Well, significantly, it is the numbered cutting system and simplified cutting diagrams and solo practice exercises that you can see here. Simple and effective terminology, diagrams and solo exercises that are well suited to the instruction of soldiers. And so when Roworth published his manual, he drew upon all of the old broadsword ways of the British Isles and combined them with these new, simple Austrian methods that had been introduced into the cavalry exercise just 2 years before. Now, Roworth was an amateur fencer, and we know he took those Austrian methods from Gaspar Le Marchant. But what about the broadsword, Scotch or British broadsword methods? Well, there are some pages in Roworth's text that are a direct lift, effectively, from older manuals, such as from Thomas Page's manual of 1746. And personally, I wouldn't consider this plagiarism. I would consider this a continuation, a direct continuation of the broadsword lineage. But Roworth didn't just learn from old books, he also had instructors and drew from knowledge from other masters and instructors of his day. Some insight into Roworth and his affiliations can be provided by the landmark legal case Roworth v. Wilks in 1807, which was a copyright or piracy case, which is still commonly used in British case law to this day. Roworth took fellow printer John Wilks to court, claiming that Wilks had plagiarised the art of defence on foot for his own Encyclopaedia Londinensis, which he had. Wilks reprinted almost the entirety of the art of defence in his Encyclopaedia Londinensis, with only minor changes to the plates. The courts clearly found in Roworth's favour, but it is the witnesses that were brought before the court which provide some massive insight for us as practitioners of Roworth's art of defence. Now, Roworth stated in court that he had created the manual himself, so we know for certain that he is the author, there's no doubt in question. He said he'd been able to produce the art of defence by his own experience and also by information given to him by gentlemen skilled in the science of fencing. Now, for those familiar with this book, you're probably thinking of one name right now, John Taylor. But no, John Taylor's involvement was later in the third edition of 1804. Who then was Roworth's original influence or instructor? Enter Major Charles James, who claimed in court to have practiced with Mr. Roworth for the purposes of his book and had provided him with the information regarding the spadroon. This claim gives us the best indication yet as to who Roworth's original influences were beyond just old books. But who exactly is Major James? James was born in 1757 or 8 and was a British Army officer and miscellaneous writer himself. He served as captain of the Western Regiment of Middlesex Militia in 1793-4 and as captain in the North York Militia from 1795 to 1797. On the 1st of March 1806, just a year before the case of Roworth v. Wilks, he was appointed Major of the Corps of Artillery Drivers attached to the Royal Artillery. Now, Major James was in France when the French Revolution broke out, and he actually wrote a lot about his experiences as he travelled through the country and all of the things that he saw. And therefore it's no surprise at all that in Roworth's section on the spadroon, he also talks about the French method of using the spadroon, and we now know that Major James supplied that information on the spadroon, and Major James spent a lot of time in France, so it ties together quite neatly. Major James also recommended Roworth's Art of Defence in his military dictionary, a commonly printed and purchased book by new officers at the time, and this work in itself was printed by none other than Charles Roworth. Therefore, we can say that Roworth's knowledge came from a number of well-experienced and well-travelled military officers and fencers, combining traditional or Highland broadsword methods with the latest Austrian or Hungarian-inspired training practices, and with a touch of French knowledge thrown in. Roworth was also a member of the Westminster Volunteers, a type of home defence force, if you like. This is not to be mistaken with the London and Westminster Light Horse Volunteers, which they often are mistaken for. Now, there were a lot of volunteer units at that time, especially because of the risk of invasion from France, so we've just got to be a bit careful about not mixing those up. Note that some of the characters in the early versions of Roworth wear bicorns worn side to side. An uncommon feature by this time, though a practice followed by the Westminster Volunteers, of which Roworth was a member. And so I think it is reasonable, as a suggestion, to say that Roworth himself posed for these plates, and so I will continue to use the illustrations from the early editions of Roworth and suggest that they probably are Roworth himself without being able to actually guarantee that fact. Roworth first published in 1798, although there was a second edition also published in the same year. The third edition of Roworth's manual, The Art of Defence, was published in 1804 and simplified certain things. It removed certain features and did simplify it, but it also significantly introduced the 10 lessons of John Taylor. But to discuss John Taylor, we have to introduce the Angelo fencing dynasty, and this was a very famous family of fencing masters through the 18th and 19th century in Britain. And the reason we have to do that is because they also used John Taylor's teachings. They are the connection between Angelo and Roworth that can be confirmed. Now, John Taylor worked with the Angelos before any affiliation with Roworth, as far as we know, between the second and third editions of Roworth. The Angelos taught a method of broadsword to the Light Horse Volunteers of London and Westminster that had been introduced by John Taylor, as we can see here in these posters in 1799. That position of swordmaster was a position later assumed by Henry Angelo himself. These posters were created at the behest of Colonel Herries of the London and Westminster Light Horse Volunteers, who was concerned and eager to improve the fitness and training of those under his command. The beautiful depictions of the Taylor lessons seen on these posters provide an exceptional companion to those practicing from the art of defence. The London and Westminster Light Horse Volunteers were a fascinating unit which experimented with all of the latest technology of the time. Now, they were a very wealthy outfit. These volunteer units were essentially middle-class volunteers self-funding something which was quite lavish and decadent, but also could, maintain order and be there as a defensive force in the event of invasion. The London and Westminsters were initially just a cavalry force. However, they soon introduced a dismounted or infantry force, which was a little bit unique for the time because they were transported upon horse-borne carriages as a form of early mounted infantry. Now, they were equipped with expensive rifles, which was an experimental and unusual technology for the time, which was quite new to the British Army. And they were also equipped with very long and large sword bayonets, which allowed them to fight with fixed bayonets, or to use their sword bayonets standalone, because it was a formidable weapon the size of a full sword. And it is seen depicted here in the training practices of the Taylor lessons in the Angelo posters. Domenico was the oldest of the Angelo fencing family, and was an Italian who'd studied fencing in France before moving to Britain and established a prestigious fencing academy with links to British royalty. His son Henry Angelo and grandson Henry Charles Angelo went on to serve as swordmasters to the London Westminster Light Horse Volunteers, as we've established, teaching the methods of their former master John Taylor. The Angelos would go on to produce the first official British Army infantry sword exercise in 1816, of which I have a first edition here, and essentially is a continuation or replacement of Roworth, even though Roworth wasn't an official manual to the army, but was widely used. Because in the Napoleonic era, there was not an official infantry sword exercise manual, but there was Charles Roworth's Art of Defence on Foot, which was recommended by a great many publications of the time for the instruction of the Army and Navy. How well Roworth knew the Angelos is really not clear, and although Aylward does claim that they were friends, it seems to be an educated guess rather than based on actual evidence. However, Angelo did stand in defence of Roworth during his case against Wilks, stating that he had purchased the book himself and received the greatest instruction from it. High praise indeed from a very famous fencing master. Now, the Angelo knowledge of the small sword is extremely well known, but what about their knowledge of broadsword beyond just what we know of John Taylor? Fortunately, Henry Angelo in his memoirs did talk about this in some detail. He explained how he would visit the Scottish journalist James Parry whilst he was imprisoned in Newgate Prison for allegedly libel in the house in 1798. Whilst visiting, Parry and Angelo would go onto the roof of the prison, where they were out of sight and exhaustively practiced the Highland broadsword methods, of which Angelo says Parry was very expert. Parry was extremely proud of his Scottish heritage and would often be seen in his national costume, as it was said of the time, and can be seen depicted here in a scene with King George in 1785. Now, it is worth mentioning at this point is over time there's been a little bit of controversy as to was Roworth the actual author of the Art of Defence, and people bring up John Taylor. Well, we know John Taylor wasn't the author, he just contributed a little bit. But there's a few other references here and there which have different names associated with the Art of Defence, and that's created a little bit of confusion. And in Angelo's Picnic, He named the author of The Art of Defence as Muck Howarth, and some people of today claim that this was in fact the real author. However, we know from the case of Roworth v Wilks, a legal proceeding that is well documented, that that is merely a spelling mistake, as we know for a fact that Roworth was the author as well as the printer of the work. Now back to John Taylor. He said in court that he posed for the plates for the 3rd edition of Roworth. Well, that means that the person you're seeing depicted within the 1804 edition of Roworth is in fact John Taylor. Taylor is the great connection between Roworth and the Angelos because he provided the 10-lesson structure for both of their works. And the two versions of Taylor's exercises that we see in Angelo and Roworth are near identical, with only the small addition of thrusts within the Roworth section. Now we know that John Taylor was swordmaster to the Westminster and London Light Horse Volunteers, but what else was he? Well, thanks to newspapers of the era, we know that he was a renowned fencer, and that he ran his own fencing school at the Great Room of the Swan Tavern, Fish Street Hill, London. He was also previously the swordmaster to the 1st Life Guards, a most prestigious position which speaks volumes with regards to his experience and reputation as a military swordsman. This was the sort of expert willing to assist and provide his name and content to Roworth's 3rd edition, and by doing so gives great weight and credibility to Roworth's teachings. On to the Jane Austen connection. This is a seemingly unlikely connection to one of the most celebrated novelists of the 19th century. Austen was an unknown author at the time who managed to secure publishing for her first work, Sense and Sensibility, through an unusual source, and that is Thomas Egerton, who was a publisher of military works. This unlikely source was probably arranged by Austen's brother Henry, a militia officer, an army agent and banker at the time. Now that publisher, Thomas Egerton, the military publisher, was a lifelong friend of Roworth, and as a result, the 1st edition of Austen's first work was printed by none other than Charles Roworth himself. Roworth would go on to print many more works for Austen and became her most regular printer, handling 16 volumes of her novels by 1818. This part of the video has nothing to do with swords and swordsmanship, but I think it's a fascinating insight into Charles Roworth's part in Georgian society. Now on to Roworth's influence on American swordsmanship. The HEMA scene, or historical fencing scene, in the United States today is huge, and a lot of them like to practice from Roworth. And ultimately, you'll be glad to know that's part of your heritage as well. The 4th and final edition of Roworth's Art of Defence was published in New York in 1824 and sold really, really well. Note that despite the American publication, the defence is still spelt the British way with the C and not with the S. Now that's because the change in spelling came about because of a drive by Noah Webster of Webster's Dictionary in the early 19th century to change to the S within American English, although it took time, it didn't happen immediately, and so you've still got that English spelling at the time. The American edition is an exact copy of the 3rd 1804 edition, but from the American market, and it was also heavily borrowed from for the American Manual of Swordsmanship by Henry Wayne in 1849 and 1850. Wayne was the sword instructor at the Military Academy at West Point, and so if you're interested in American swordsmanship in the early to mid-19th century, Roworth will be a key source for you. Or if you choose to study Wayne, you will still be firmly rooted in the Roworth tradition. So the Art of Defence, is it a sabre manual, is it a broadsword manual? Well, the answer is yes to both of those questions. It is both, for it was a unified method with only small adjustments recommended when changing between weapons to best make use of their attributes or limitations. In fact, this is no different to manuals that came before and after it. You can justifiably call it a broadsword manual, a sabre manual, a spadroon manual, or merely a manual of military swordsmanship. Charles Roworth of Bell Yard, Temple Bar, was born in 1763 and died on the 18th of December 1850 at the age of 86, a grand old age for the time. Recently I discovered the location of Roworth's burial at Highgate Cemetery in North London. Highgate Cemetery is a work of architectural art and is well worth a visit, and is the resting place of many famous people, including philosopher and political theorist Karl Marx of all people. Now Roworth's grave has gone forgotten, covered and unvisited for a great many years. But I had the team at Highgate uncover the stone, clean it up, and they did a fantastic job which you can read about here. In conclusion, what we can say about Charles Roworth is he was an enthusiastic amateur of fencing and a keen student of military swordsmanship, and with the help and guidance of renowned fencers of his day, he left us with one of the most accessible and useful manuals of the subject, which gives us a fascinating and thorough insight into military swordsmanship in the Napoleonic and late Georgian era. I really hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you got something for it. Good luck with your practices. Remember to check the links in the description because there's some really good resources you can see through the original PDFs from some of the original Roworth works, as well as others, including Angelo. I hope you enjoyed the video, and please do subscribe if you haven't already.